Reach out now, baby. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands, struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. If you feel my heart break, oh, don't just count the sound waves. Hold me close, now, baby, and you give me your arms to struggle. If you hear my love song, if you see me crying, don't just don't just pat my shoulder. Help me to go on, help me to go right on. When you give me your strength to struggle. If you hear my love song, don't just stand back and listen. I need you to help me, sing it right now. Will you give me your voice, to the struggle? Then we'll be moving, really, moving, building up our union. If you give your all to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands. Woo! Give your hands to struggle. Give your all to struggle. Give your light to struggle. Give your love to struggle. Give your voice to struggle. Give your words to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Give your hands to struggle. Sometimes. Sometimes you need to know just a little. Sometimes you need to cry just a little. Oh, let it go, and get back in the struggle, Thank you. Thank you. Need to keep your hands. Everybody, snap your fingers. Yeah. to struggle. Yeah.
Good evening, and welcome to Movement Building in a Time of Crisis. My name is Noam Sanweiss-Back, and I'm the Director of Partnerships for the Kairos Center, and I'm delighted to be the moderator for tonight's important discussion. Tonight, we are gathering in a moment of significant systemic crisis, a Kairos moment, when the tectonic plates of our society are shifting beneath our feet and new awakenings are struggling to be born. The litany of compounding crises are already far too familiar to most of us by now. There is, of course, the climate crisis, which is intensifying storms like Hurricane Helene and Milton. War and mass violence permeate the planet, often fueled and funded by our own government, while back at home, police violence, mass incarceration, and draconian immigration enforcement bring the military state into our daily lives. Meanwhile, authoritarian leaders are seizing power around the world. In just a few weeks, we will have a better sense of just how much power Christian nationalists will wield within the White House and Congress. And one through line of these crises is a shameful and worsening reality. We are living in the most economically unequal time in modern history. Indeed, at a time when the wealth of the 3 richest Americans now exceeds $500 billion, there are 140 million poor and low-income people in this country. During the early years of the COVID-19 pandemic, this economic inequality accelerated at an unprecedented pace, even as the virus spread along the fissures of our society. Before the pandemic, millions of people suffered under the oppressive weight of rising costs, low wages, bad to no health insurance, and more. In the absence of a united, robust, and sustained government response, these pre-existing conditions contributed to the over 1 million pandemic-related deaths in this country, the highest mortality rate in the world. In a forthcoming report from the Kairos Center, Surviving Pending Revolution, Lessons from the Pandemic for Building a Movement to End Poverty, my colleagues Shali Gupta-Barnes and Jarvis Benson write that, quote, where our national systems could not or would not deliver, local communities stepped in through mutual aid, community organizing, religious ministries, and other forms of care, and that, quote, these efforts saved an untold number of lives. They also offered a glimpse into how our society might be organized to realize substantive democracy, where we all have a meaningful say over the decisions that impact our lives. In their report, my colleagues synthesized some of the survival strategies that poor and dispossessed communities deployed during the most intense periods of the pandemic, and they offer recommendations for how these strategies can continue to inform our movement building. In the coming months, Kairos will be leading a number of strategic conversations and trainings on the insights and lessons that they gathered in this report. And tonight, we are fortunate to be joined by a fabulous panel of leaders who are going to help us zoom out and understand the broader context from which this report and the survival strategies of the poor are emerging. We are joined by Dr. Rakin Mahbood, Lindsay Kashgarian, Aaron Heaney, Jose Vasquez, Scott Nakagawa, Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, and Reverend Tracy Blackman. Dr. Rakin Mahbood is the chief economist and a senior fellow at Groundwork Collaborative and serves as a leading policy expert and spokesperson on how economic trends impact people's everyday lives, with a particular attention to structural disparities by race and gender. Lindsay Kashgarian is the program director of the National Priorities Project, focusing on the militarization of the federal budget and the corresponding lack of investment in people and the planet. Aaron Heaney is executive director of Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURGE. Aaron's work focuses on building working class power among white communities and voters throughout the US, focusing on the South, Appalachia, and the Rust Belt to defend and expand multiracial democracy. Jose Vasquez is the executive director of Common Defense, a diverse grassroots organization of US veterans and military family members. He served 15 years in the US Army and was honorably discharged in 2007. Scott Nakagawa is co-founder and executive director of the 22nd Century Initiative. Scott is a veteran of social and economic justice advocacy and has served as an organizer, political strategist, and social movement analyst in the struggle against authoritarianism and for equitable and inclusive democracy since 1988. Reverend Liz Theoharis is executive director of the Kairos Center and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Moral Revival. Reverend Liz is an ordained minister of the Presbyterian Church, USA, and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And finally, Reverend Tracy Blackman is a pastor, preacher, theologian, and national leader in the fight for racial and economic justice. Reverend Blackman was most recently the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. And also joining me are my colleagues, Sierra Taylor and Aaron Scott with the Episcopal Church, and formerly a staff member here at Kairos. So tonight's panel is going to be separated into 3 parts. Part 1 will focus on our current economic conditions. Part 2 will focus on movement building within our current political context and amid the rise of authoritarianism. And part 3 will focus on the religious and theological dynamics of this moment. After the panel, we'll have some time for Q&A. And after that, Sierra, Aaron, and Shali will share some concluding thoughts on a few ways we can sustain movement building in this moment of crisis. And throughout this webinar, feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and I'll do my best to raise them with folks when the time comes. You can also turn the closed captioning on by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so part 1, economic conditions with Joaquin and Lindsay, if the both of you want to join me back on the screen. Joaquin, let's start with you. I know it's a tall order for a short amount of time, but would love for you to just offer some framing remarks on how we can be thinking about our current economic reality.
Sure. Thank you, Noam, for that wonderful introduction. And hello, everyone. Really glad to be here. And thank you to Kairos for hosting such an incredible conversation, an important conversation. I'm really glad to be here and looking forward to hearing everyone's questions. So as Noam mentioned, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the state of the economy. And, I think it makes sense for me to start out with some numbers. So by all objective measures, the economy actually looks pretty good right now. Inflation is finally easing. It's at 2.4% year over year, the lowest reading since February of 2021. The unemployment rate is relatively low at 4.1%. And we've had a genuinely remarkable recovery from a deep and sudden shock to our economy, namely the pandemic and the recession that followed. But numbers don't always tell the full story of how people are experiencing the economy. At Groundwork, we always say we are the economy. Then when all of us, regular people, especially folks who have historically been left on the margins, are doing well, that's when our economy is doing its best. And so those numbers don't necessarily capture the fact that even if the price of things is slowing, like the price growth is slowing down, that prices are still high for people, or the experience of someone who is unemployed. And I do think it's worth putting on the table that there's a lot to celebrate. We've made over the last couple of years some pretty big people-centered investments like the CHIPS and Science Act, the IRA, but fundamentally we are still living in an economy that's ruled by a neoliberal ideology, an ideology that believes that if the wealthy do well, then the rest of us will kind of get the scraps because it'll all trickle down to the rest of us. And I want to kind of focus my remarks maybe on something a little bit surprising, which is taxes and our tax code. At the end of next year, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was a series of really, really big tax cuts for the wealthy and large corporations, passed in 2017 by President Trump and Republicans in Congress. Those tax cuts are expiring, at least individuals are expiring. And part of the reason I wanted to spend some time talking about the tax fight is because the tax code in many ways crystallizes our neoliberal ideology. It makes it the air and we all breathe, the sea we all swim in. Over and over again, including in 2017, we were told the myth that cutting taxes for the super rich and big corporations would trickle down and benefit everyone. But time and time again, we've seen that the opposite is true. And for the past 50 years, I've seen soaring inequality fueled by tax cuts that allowed and incentivized those at the very top to extract for themselves. So where has that gotten us? According to the CBO, the average income for the top 1% of households is now 42 times greater than the average income for the bottom 90% of households. And wealth inequality is even worse. The top 0.1% of households now hold 13.6% of the nation's total wealth. And when you look at how much wealth is held by the very tippy top of the distribution relative to Black Americans and other historically excluded groups, the numbers are even starker. And it's not just households. Corporations have amassed immense wealth and power, and the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act just added fuel to that fire. Among its many damaging provisions, the TCJA lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And former President Trump has promised to cut corporate taxes even further to 15% if elected. So that all sounds like very DC and very high level, right? But I do think it's worth spending some time kind of thinking about what that means for us. That's a shocking policy proposal, lowering taxes to 15%. We are coming out of an inflationary period where large corporations saw record profits because of profiteering, right? Because all of us were paying for their profits and for their shareholders to get paid out. Corporate profits reached an all-time high earlier this year, not post-pandemic, all-time high. We've seen corporations funneling billions and billions of dollars in stock buybacks, what one of my colleagues calls the cotton candy part of our economy. It has no nutritional value. It just makes the rich richer. It doesn't actually improve any actual part of our economy. All while everyday people struggle to put food on the table and buy diapers for their children. We've seen that over and over and over again over the last few years. And we've heard these executives bragging on their earnings calls about their ability to get away with it. So what we're left with after years and years of trickle-down ideology, after years and years of tax cuts for the wealthy and big corporations, is an economy that's failing to meet its full potential because modern-day bandits are benefiting from rules that they set up to favor themselves at the expense of the rest of us. We're left with an economy where ever deeper corporate tax cuts have drained our collective coffers and undermined our ability to take on projects on behalf of the public and on behalf of our communities. So yes, we have made some progress, and by aggregate numbers, things are okay, but there's a lot of work left to do. I think we are coming out of a period where the Biden administration has taken this very fresh and very people-centered approach to crisis, right? They put money into people's pockets. They invested in long neglected parts of our economy, like our supply chains and our clean energy transition, really using the power of government to try and tackle some of the big challenges that Noam laid out at the top. And that is exciting. But just because we've done it once doesn't mean that we're going to continue on that path. And it's really on all of us to continue to push and challenge our policymakers and our leaders to put people at the center of their economy. Because at the end of the day, inequality is a massive problem in this country. Poverty is still a massive problem in this country. And we have a long way to go before we actually put this incredibly harmful neoliberal ideology to rest. The 2025 tax fight, the fight that's coming up next year, is just one federal fight that I'm specifically focused on because of my role at Groundwork. But I do also think it's worth all of us kind of paying attention to what's going on in DC, because these are pivot moments, right? These are moments where we get to change the rules of the game, and we can change it in favor of the rest of us. So I'll maybe leave it at that, and really looking forward to the other panelists' comments and your questions.
So Rukin, I'm actually really glad you've honed in on tax policy, because I think it raises fundamental questions about just, the objective abundance that is flowing through our economy, and how that abundance is or isn't directed. And I think that just is actually a really good segue to you, Lindsay, since so much of your research is focused on an aspect of the economy that I think most folks don't really spend any time thinking about, in many ways by design, which is our military and our military spending and its relationship with the whole of our economy and the resources and priorities of government policy. So yeah, I'd just be curious for you to get in there and share a little bit on your research and how you're reading this moment.
Yeah, thanks, Noam, and thanks, Rukin, for your great setup comments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our leaders' priorities are right now, and Rukin talked about some things that we need to fix, and whether those things are getting the right amount of attention, or whether all of the other things we care about are getting the right amount of attention and the right amount of resources. And of course, a lot of those resources are not going where they should be and are going to the military instead. I'm going to talk about this particular moment because Violence for the sake of power is as old as time, but we are in a particularly terrible moment right now. So just in terms of context, we all know that Hurricane Helene just swept through several states in the South, hit really hard. It was a terrible, terrible event, 300 deaths so far and many people missing. These are not just storm or flood deaths, these are climate change deaths. And that's something that, of course, we could work to prevent. Meanwhile, FEMA, the agency that's supposed to go down and help people, is facing a funding shortfall and Congress is declining to act. At the same time, there were multiple dams in North Carolina and Tennessee that were at the point of failure because of the Hurricane Helene flooding, and some of that could have been prevented and could be prevented in the future with adequate spending on infrastructure. So there's lots of things that we need money for, but a lot of where the money is going is to the wrong things, which is militarism. And Noah mentioned military and war, and that's where a lot of it goes. But when we talk about militarism, we really talk about militarism everywhere. It's the wars in other countries, it's militarism at our borders, it's the militarism in our own communities, and how our government funds and sponsors all of that. It's all part of one big system. So we also know that right now, in this moment, one of the big places in the world where terrible things are happening, in large part fed by our government, is in Gaza in the Middle East. It's been over a year of ruthless violence. The violence is spreading to Syria, Yemen, which the US bombed this week, Iran, and very, very consequently, Lebanon. So that is getting bigger and bigger. And just also this week, the US sent troops for the first time to Israel in this conflict, to Israel, to help run US missile defense systems. So the US involvement is getting deeper and deeper. Many of the weapons that have been used to commit war crimes and genocidal actions in Gaza have been US provided weapons. And we have documentation of many cases of that. So far, this has cost the United States and us $22 billion. And it's just going to get bigger. Before the Iraq War, the Bush administration officials estimated that that war would cost $50 billion. It ended up costing 60 times that much. It was over $3 trillion in the end. Overall, in the 20 years after 9/11, the US spent a total between the Iraq War, Afghanistan War, those wars spreading to Syria, Pakistan, other countries, and our militarism at home, we spent $21 trillion in those 20 years, more than $1 trillion every year for militarism. Meanwhile, the situation in the Middle East, all of those countries could likely simmer down and be brought to an end just with the simple solution of a ceasefire. Not that it's been simple to enact, but it is a simple solution. I also want to talk about our militarism here at home, and we're hearing a lot about mass deportation right now. And there are 13 million undocumented people in this country with families, communities, homes, livelihoods, and we're hearing about mass deportation. I won't even go into some of the other things that we're hearing. It's truly horrifying, racist and dehumanizing talk that I know you all are aware of. But what a lot of people in this country don't know who may support mass deportation, first of all, they probably don't know what that actually means. They don't know what it looks like. And they also don't know that the American Immigration Council recently estimated that it would cost about $1 trillion over 10 years to deport 13 million people. So in addition to the tremendous human suffering and crime against humanity that would be, it's also would be a huge cost to the country, and one that we obviously don't need to undertake. And just because I'm saying trillion this, trillion that, I want to give a little context on $1 trillion and what that is. It's roughly twice what the federal government spends every year on housing, education, public health, the environment, clean air and water, medical research, all combined. So it's quite a bit of money and could make a huge difference if it were reallocated to those things. And I'll just finish by saying that there are people who benefit from this, right? It's the power-hungry politicians, it's military contractors whose stock prices soared in the week after October 7th of last year, because they knew that this meant months, if not years, of ongoing weapons sales for them. I also want to point out, just to my final point, the same week that Hurricane Helene hit the South, FEMA had a $9 billion shortfall in funding for what they needed to do. That same week, the US sent $8.7 billion of weapons to Israel. It sent $8 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine, and it sent $500 million worth of weapons to Taiwan. So at the same time that we couldn't come up with $9 billion for FEMA, we came up with all of those billions to send weapons to other countries. So I'll end there, and really appreciate you all being here tonight.
I was muted. I'm back. Hi, thank you so much, Lindsay and Joaquin, both of you. Just like, you know, a teaser, I think, for more conversation in the Q&A. I'm gonna queue up the next section of this panel, but we'll see you both soon. So Scott and Aaron and Jose, if you want to join me. And I think Lindsay's concluding remarks there, though, were really helpful in setting up this this next part on the current political context, and especially sort of the rise of authoritarianism in this moment, and even just the ways we're seeing in part of 2025, for instance, the plans for full-scale kind of militarized society, both at home and abroad, and the ways the conditions that Lindsay was laying out could only accelerate in the days to come. So I think we're going to start, Aaron, with you in your vantage point with surge and organizing working class white folks into multiracial movements. Just would be great to get your perspective on how you're understanding this particular political moment 3 weeks out from the elections, and then we'll go to Jose and then Scott.
Great. Thanks, Noam. And it's really good to be with you, Jose and Scott, as always, and the broader crew here tonight. Well, I will start with the fact that I'm from Buffalo, New York, and that's where I am tonight. And it's a place that's seen some really rough years because of the divestment that Joaquin and Lindsay were just talking about, and where, in response, the white Christian nationalist right really has grown in strength over the course of my life. We had the first member of Congress to endorse Trump, the second highest number of people that were there on the Capitol on January 6th. And of course, Buffalo was in the news a couple of years ago because of the white nationalist massacre that happened at Tops supermarket, which led to the murder of 10 Black folks just a couple of years ago. So, I grew up in a split household where I had union members on one side and militia members on the other. And I grew up in my house knowing that we had the things we had in our lives because my dad was part of the union, and that he was part of struggle with other people to get the things that we needed in our lives. And a couple of years ago, I went to a family reunion in upstate New York and realized that a number of my family members were wearing 3%er militia gear, which of course are one of the white nationalist militias that popped up after Obama was elected, and certainly been part of the growing white nationalist movement. So I think, part of what we're seeing at Surge, my family is an example of how people are not kind of formed, but really can go one way or the other based on who is organizing them and who is helping them make sense of so much of the devastation and heartbreak and suffering that people are experiencing in the world right now, that we've already begun to touch in on tonight. And, I think in the absence of a political home or a union, for many people in my family, we've seen the ways in which the right wing is recruiting them in every aspect of their lives, online, at shooting clubs, at church. Folks are being pulled towards more authoritarian movements to try to make sense of the world and have, connection and belonging. And, while the core of Trump's base is not working people, like the guys on January 6th were not poor people, right? They got there and they had a lot of gear with them. Across the country, we are seeing authoritarian forces working to make gains among working and poor people in this community, across the country. And part of the way that we make sense of that at Surge, and with many other people in the movement, is that that this did not happen overnight, right? That this has been part of a strategy. There's like many dynamics at play, which I'm sure Scott and Jose will talk more about. But two of them that we think are really important is the attack by corporate forces on the labor movement and on organized labor, which was a large political working class institution that was imperfect as the labor movement is, organized labor. It was an institution that brought people together and still does bring together working people across lines of difference, and did build multiracial working class solidarity. And then, of course, after in the aftermath of passing the Voting Rights Act in '64, there was, the GOP and other corporate forces came together to advance the Southern strategy, which, of course, was a strategy and a way to build a path to governing power that was really rooted in stoking racism. That was how they thought they'd build a path to power, and they certainly have succeeded. So those two dynamics have led to some really challenging organizing terrain for many of us to be out there, but it's part of what's got to be done in this moment. And so that's some of the work that Surge is up to. We see ourselves as part of the big multiracial movement that we need to fight back against, the forces that we're up against. And while we know that our opposition is recruiting people of all races and genders, the elephant in the room often is that the biggest part of our opposition's base is overwhelmingly white. And we know the ways in which the right has used racism to separate white communities and make sure that our communities, for those of us who are white, remain silent on the sidelines or even antagonistic to movements for justice or pro-democracy movements that are really fighting for a better world for all of us. And so we do work in communities where we know our opposition and authoritarian forces are strong, to try to move people off the sidelines and into solidarity. So maybe I'll share just two quick stories about what we've been up to. We've been on the ground. Most recently, I'll tell a story about Tennessee and North Carolina. We've been doing work in Tennessee for quite a few years at this point. And our work in the state really kicked off after there were a number of rallies that were being planned by the Klan in Tennessee in the aftermath of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And they planned a number of rallies in rural parts of the state, and we had a number of people who lived in those places reach out to us who had been connected to Surge's work and say, we don't want to let these folks run through our town. And so we supported people to begin knocking doors and talking to their neighbors about what it meant that what they thought about the fact that the Klan was there in their communities, knocking doors and dropping lit. And we also talked to people about the suffering that they were experiencing. What were the struggles that were in their lives as well? And we had hundreds and hundreds of conversations in small towns in Tennessee. And we found that the issue that was impacting people most deeply was housing. People didn't have a safe or affordable place to live. And so we began bringing people together to be able to fight back against that. I'm sure in campaigns like many people on this call have been part of. And so we did things like putting pressure on city council. We worked with faith communities to keep people in their homes. We made sure people had food and the things they needed to be able to hang together. And we built a lot of strong relationships and a home, I think, that was really giving people purpose and belonging and helping people understand that they needed each other and we needed each other to be able to get the things we needed in our lives. That process also helped really make very clear for folks who their true enemies were, right? And it was certainly not the immigrant folks in their community who they lived down the street with or sometimes right next door to. It became very, very clear to folks who the true enemies were. It was people in the state legislature that were blocking them from passing legislation at the local level that would improve people's lives. It was some of the white nationalist groups that were very closely embedded with some of the landlords who were profiting off of people being not able to keep their families safe. And so through that process, a lot of people have found a different kind of political home. A couple of years ago, we were able to elect one of our members to city council on an anti-Klan, pro-renter, pro-working class agenda. This is in a town that Trump won by 70 percentage points. So I think this is a really powerful example that it is possible to organize in places where folks are really suffering. And when we are able to give people a sense of connection, belonging, and agency, that folks are way less vulnerable to some of the advances that the authoritarian forces are trying to make in our communities. Second quick story I'll tell, is that we're We're also, we've been on the ground in North Carolina, of course, where the hurricane just came through and devastated, and we're facing, in some ways a different, in some ways very similar challenge. We know that in the wake of many of these disasters, we see a really ruthless strategy unfold, and we see two sets of forces, both of whom are our enemies, the far right and corporate power, really use moments like this to advance their agendas, right? Like they advance disaster capitalism, right? We see corporations swoop in and try to seize profits and privatize things like water, education, healthcare, the few public things we have left in this country. We see in these moments corporate forces try to privatize and create less public goods. The other thing we're seeing on the ground too is that we see the ways in which the far right use moments like this to be able to gross their forces too. And we've seen over and over again, and folks may have seen this is also happening in North Carolina, there are right-wing militia groups that will show up in the aftermath of these storms and provide housing and water and clothing to people, right? To advance the story that the government doesn't care about them, and that they're caring instead for Black and brown people, right? And we know that that can be an on-ramp into the world of white nationalism. And so, at Surge, part of what we're up to is also trying to intervene in these dynamics and provide for people, take care of people in very material ways, and help, again, bring people into a posture of solidarity, right? And so right now in Western North Carolina, we're out there knocking doors. We are trying to make sure that people are connected and have the things they need. And it's been challenging. There's not working phones, there's not a lot of open roads, but we're trying to show up, caring for people, trying to build that sense of belonging, meeting people's needs, and with the hope and real belief that people will stick with us over time. So, I think I'll just say maybe in conclusion, I think part of what we're seeing on the ground is that, the far right and authoritarian movements can really thrive when they have no competition, when there's no one else in so many of these communities. And so part of what I think the task is for us to really expand organizing in communities that have, less organizing infrastructure, and to really be with people, both in meeting their needs and fighting for a different world where all of us can get our needs met. So yeah, that's some of how we're seeing this play out on the ground.
Wow, Erin, thank you. That was fabulous. Jose, I'm just going to go straight to you. Kairos and Common Defense just did a joint study for our staff on really trying to dig into the contours of Project 2025 and understanding what its implications might be for both poor and working class folks and for veterans and military families and others. And I just think that you and Common Defense really have a very unique, particular kind of vantage point on this moment, organizing vets and active military folks and their family members. So yeah, I just would love for you to get in there and share what you're seeing.
Thanks, Noam. Yeah, appreciate it. And happy to be on this panel with Erin, Scott, and all the other esteemed panelists. So I'm Jose Vasquez, Executive Director at Common Defense. I'm calling from New York City. And I want to kind of direct my comments to two different areas. One, just kind of picking up where Lindsay Kashgarian left off in terms of how much we're spending on defense. I think some folks assume that, those billions and trillions of dollars are getting spent on veterans after they leave the military. But actually the opposite is true. The right has been very effectively pushing for essentially privatizing the VA. And I think their ultimate goal is to just get rid of it altogether. Folks might not be aware, but the Veterans Administration is like the largest integrated healthcare system in the country. So it's essentially like, our primary experiment with like socialized medicine, right? And I'm sure folks have heard many horror stories about the VA, but by and large, the VA does a lot of great work. They're very comprehensive in their approach to how they treat veterans. Accessing it is not always easy, especially if you don't, if you have anything other than an honorable discharge. So there's often an uphill battle for people to be registered with the VA in the first place. And then it also depends on how many years you served and whether you were active duty or National Guard. So there's a lot of hoops before you can actually access the VA. There's about 16 million vets that are alive today. Only 9 million of them are registered with the VA, and annually they treat about 6 million vets, just to give folks a sense of the scale. I know we want to talk about authoritarianism, but just want to flag for folks that during the pandemic, and since then, the VA has treated over or close to 1 million folks for COVID-19. And throughout the VA system, as according to the VA, they've recorded 26,000 deaths of folks during COVID-19. The VA also had a massive immunization program for COVID-19 vaccines. And so they not only treated veterans, but they also treated their family members, their employees, and other folks in the community. And so the VA was responsible for at least 5 million vaccinations across the country as a healthcare system, which is really important. And so when you think about the fact that in Project 2025, specifically Chapter 20 talks specifically about what the kind of right wing wants to do with the VA. It's all about privatization, which they kind of cloak under the banner of choice, right? They want to give veterans choice, and they are essentially trying to push for more and more parts of it to become privatized, to be able to veterans can go to civilian health care providers in order to get treated there as opposed to at the VA. But the problem with that is that most healthcare providers are not prepared to deal with the kind of comorbidities that many veterans walk in with, and also don't do the kind of extensive research that the VA does for the very specific things that veterans have been exposed to. For example, Agent Orange, depleted uranium, and exposure to burn pits, that sort of thing. And so it's scary to think that while veterans might feel like it's more convenient, for example, to go to a civilian provider that's near them, but I think we've all dealt with the U.S. healthcare system, and it's not exactly a walk in the park. In addition, there's no guarantee that the VA will cover everything that a healthcare provider does in terms of treatment for someone. And so, if you have access to the VA, there's very little out-of-pocket costs. There are some like co-pays for medications. It also has everything to do with what your disability rating is and that sort of thing, and how long you served in the military. But if you go to a civilian provider, the VA may cover part of it, but you may also get a bill from that civilian provider. And so there's a lot of concern about that. So in addition, I think to Aaron's point about just folks getting recruited for a lot of reasons, right-wing groups like Proud Boys and Blood Tribe and 3%ers are specifically targeting folks with military experience because of the capacity for violence and the training that people have received while they're in the military. Often what happens is if a veteran joins one of those groups at the local level, they'll sort of become the trainer for the rest of the folks that are joining the militia, right? And so you'll see them, running exercises very similar to what you would see in the military, where folks are doing squad tactics and, how to move as a group, how to shoot, how to communicate with each other, and, some hand-to-hand combat and that sort of thing. So, in addition, the folks that were, that have been facing accountability around January 6th, it's something like 20 to 30% of the folks that were part of that and that have been, prosecuted for that were connected to the military, either veterans, some of them were in the National Guard, some of them even active duty. And so, deeply concerning to think about folks with that level of training. Aaron mentioned some of the gear that people wear, and frankly, some of those folks that showed up on January 6th had better gear than you would get issued from the military. So, it might be tempting to sort of be dismissive of these folks because they're not sort of like professionalized, but I think more and more military personnel or former military personnel are getting involved in these, right-wing groups. So that's the bad news. I think the good news is similar to Serge and many other folks that are on this call, Common Defense is, in our strategic plan, we say we're trying to build the largest grassroots army of progressive veterans in modern U.S. history. So small feat to accomplish there, but we're building a base of progressive vets across the country. Right now, we're focused on 5 key states, which are Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And we've got staff in all of those states. We just recently launched a kind of organizing model where we brought members together and did a state organizing committee retreat. So bringing together vets from across those various states that I mentioned, and doing leadership development, doing de-escalation training. We're doing counter extremism training with them, and also what to do if these right-wing groups show up and do like a kind of protest or show of force in your communities, like how to document it, how to identify which groups they are based on the kind of signage and how they dress and all of that, which is very similar to the kind of thing we would do in the military in terms of identifying, quote unquote, the enemy. So there's that. But I also think that, by doing organizing with veterans, it's creating an alternative for folks that might be tempted to take that pathway. The sad reality is that folks that are drawn into these right-wing groups have actual grievances, right? That are real, right? Whether it's unemployment or lack of access to healthcare or, the like substance abuse issues and all of that. And I think with the ideology that comes along with these groups, right, that sort of helps them make sense of why they don't have a job, why they can't access healthcare, why the government screwed them over as a veteran and they don't have access to the VA or to education benefits or housing benefits or that kind of thing. And I think the sort of like replacement theory that folks have, which I particularly is appealing to white folks, but don't get it twisted. Like there's people of color are also joining these organizations. You think about it, Enrique Tarrio and the Proud Boys. He's of Cuban descent, so it's not limited to white folks. And I think that by doing organizing in some of these kind of battleground states, it's important to demonstrate that there's an alternative. Right, there are vets that are organizing in favor of democracy, organizing against the genocide in Gaza, right? Seeing veterans out there and trying to connect the dots between what's happening in Gaza, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the many other wars that we've been involved in. And and I think that we have been growing by leaps and bounds, which is super encouraging. So excited to share more about the work during the Q&A. And to connect with other organizations that are doing work in those states, but also nationally, because we're across the U.S. And last but not least, I think that this election is probably giving people a lot of anxiety. But I will tell you that at least in the veterans community, there is a lot of excitement about this ticket, especially because of Walls running for it. Him, seeing a fellow vet involved in that is kind of bringing a lot of vets out of the woodwork, and certainly seeing another 4 years of Trump is pretty just terrible alternative to what we hope to see. And so I think that from the work that we're doing, it's encouraging to see how much excitement we're getting, how much membership growth we're seeing, how many people we're seeing show up on national membership calls and door knocking and that sort of thing. So I'll stop there and pitch it over to Noam.
Thanks, Jose. That was great. Aaron, I know you're going to need to hop in a sec, so just wanted to thank you again. We'll see you soon.
Thanks to you all. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Unfortunately, it means that with Scott and Jose being the only ones, you've got all of these books, and I've just got this little line of books. So I feel a little bit outmatched here. But Scott, I wanted to bring you in. We wanted Jose and Aaron to go first and kind of drill down a little bit on the work that they're doing and who they're organizing, and then wanted to bring you in to kind of peel the lens back, peel the frame back a little bit. You've been, studying and actively, fighting against and organizing around, authoritarian movements for the better part of the last 4 decades. In 5 or 6 minutes, I'm going to give you the task of helping us understand how we got here. How we arrived in a moment when Jose and Aaron, are describing the conditions that, the folks that they're organizing are confronting and coming up against. So yeah, try to get in there as much as you're able to.
Okay. Well, I'm going to use notes, so please feel free to interrupt me because it is, a story packed with information. So, just to begin with, to ground us in the moment that we're in, the VDEM Institute, which is an institute in Sweden that is a democracy watchdog organization, issues annual democracy reports. And in their latest, the picture of democracy globally doesn't look good, right? So there's a global democratic decline underway. 71% of the global population now lives under autocratic regimes, and that's compared to 48% a decade ago. And year over year, there seem to be gains on the part of authoritarians. There's a general trend toward autocracy. It is affecting about 35% of the world's population, including major democracies like India and countries like in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where they're among the most affected. The progress of democracy is not good. There's some standouts like Brazil made some significant gains, but generally speaking, on the whole, we're going in the wrong direction. And particularly on key components of democracy, freedom of expression, clean elections, and civil society and freedom of association. All of those things are declining. Like I said, the news in general is not good. But I share it with you because I think it's really important for us to have our eyes on the world, because the movement that we're being faced with here in the United States, this white Christian nationalist movement, is not just here at home, but also learning from other authoritarians and autocrats abroad within networks that they share, and developing their strategies and tactics in that context. So we should be looking to the countries of the world that are being affected by autocracy now to try to learn from them and start to develop our toolkits and our knowledge about the issues, because there's much to learn from places abroad, including Brazil, El Salvador, India, Thailand, the Philippines, Myanmar, many places where pro-democracy activists may be under siege, but are actually making some progress. So with that, though, the story of the rise of authoritarianism as has been repeated over and over again recently, decades old, right? Goes all the way back to the middle of the 20th century, and is basically rooted in racist and misogynistic populism on the right, deployed in particular by one of our two major parties, you know which one, in order to break with a long tradition of domination on the part of the other party, especially at the national level and national policymaking. Because that agenda on the right was not a popular one, it's quite an elite agenda. They exploited cultural fault lines around race and gender in order to build a reactionary base they could mobilize in defense of what they called traditional family values. The real agenda for most elites on the right was not social but economic, and specifically neoliberal. Right. So by building a reactionary base of politics and doing it in a way that divided their opposition, their reactionary plurality that they built with this traditional family values agenda was able to exercise majoritarian power and put the opposition party to their left on its heels, forcing it to adapt to neoliberalism, which then alienated the traditional base of that party, which are workers like us, right? While adopting a popular front strategy of what I sometimes call identity populism. These moves in the right and left neglected the issues that most of us share and have driven polarization from above. But when it comes down to it, we still share most issues in common, right? We're not as polarized as people think we are. Instead, what's happening is that political parties have driven polarization, and they've also limited our choices in elections in ways that reflect their agendas. But the voters assume that those who are elected reflect the values of the entire base of each of those parties. And especially those who are the most politically engaged on the right and the left, who are paying attention to politics and so know what the agendas of the autocrats are. They understand what the policy agendas of those who oppose them are, and interpret that as something that's understood broadly in the whole base, right? And this has ignited a kind of conflict between left and right that is actually starting to drive centrist voters toward authoritarian solutions. So it's a problem that we need to address. And we need to address it in part because this extreme polarization has basically undermined the possibility of multiracial democracy in the United States. There is not sufficient trust in our institutions. Civil society is far too divided for us to be able to be secure in advancing, continuing to advance social inclusion and expand upon our democratic freedoms. And so this is really important thing to know. So I draw some of this information from Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I recommend you go and read her because she's online and you can find all of her stuff. But you know, basically the way that this has affected us is that you know, we are in a situation now where, because of the interpretation of that kind of extreme polarization driven from the top down by the most politically active on the left and the right, that then interpretation and the way we've reacted to it is driving something else called affective polarization, which is emotional polarization, the kind of polarization that drives political violence. And so that's the situation we're in. And I named this specifically among many things we could be talking about, because this kind of extreme polarization is something we can actually do something about. So, you know, one of the things that will be really critically important to us in this time is to recognize that those of us who identify with the left, as I do, have a lot more power than we might imagine ourselves being if we could reframe some of the key issues in ways that actually deflect some of that polarization as one thing, right? And then start building trust in local institutions through actually holding them accountable. You know, a lot of what's happening out there is people talk about trust in institutions and they basically talk about it, right? They try to convince us that we must trust our institutions in order to save our democracy. But the reality is that in places around the world where people are doing that work, they're doing it through working on local issues, winning representation within those institutions, including very small institutions like, you know, the water board or, you know, the, you know, like a, what do you call it? Basically the equivalent of like dog catcher type of offices. And then demanding more transparency, more accountability, and driving good governance. So for example, in Thailand, one of the you know, great successes of the Future Forward and the Move Forward parties, which has been making great advances for democracy there, has been around potable water. So because potable water is a real issue for most people in Thailand, they can't afford to buy clean water. It's something that most people hold in common, that they want drinkable water. And so what they're doing is basically targeting the institutions that are responsible for water quality and winning spots in those institutions for people who are from communities that are the most affected by those issues, and then demanding transparency in the process in order to engage people in what amounts to truth, reconciliation, and repair around the issue of water. So there are lots of things like that that we can do, and I think that is in the staple kind of issue agenda of the Kairos Center. So good for you on that, right? You're a great teacher on those issues for all of us. But you know, it's from those kinds of small local acts up to much bigger things that we can do around reframing the way we're approaching these issues. And one of the things that the Thai informant I spoke to told me that I thought was particularly helpful was she said that they focus in their work on opportunity and not on restrictions. So rather than talking about how many restrictions are on you, which is basically narrating the power of authoritarians in your life and perhaps driving more fear, chilling the possibility of broad-based organizing, what they do instead is they talk about opportunity. And they don't just talk about it, they also illustrate it. And so, you know, I've seen some political ads that they produce, and, you know, they're not the kinds of political ads we produce in the United States where somebody's screaming about the opposition party. There are ads in which people of all different ethnicities in colorful clothing are dancing and singing together and basically acting out freedom of expression, acting out the right to protest, acting out all of the different things that have been limited or robbed from them there as a way of inspiring in people a sense of hope and possibility that if I join the party and I take part, I can be part of the change that I want to see in the world. And, it taps into a deep longing that people have that I think is also evident here in the United States. We saw this when, one of our two candidates dropped out and someone replaced him that, lifted people's spirits, and the amount of outpouring of joy that we saw in that moment really speaks to just how much people want to see something positive and to be able to work toward that end. So just to keep it in mind, there's in the 40 or so years that I've been doing this particular kind of work on the right, I started out being in what people now refer to as fight the right mode, right? We exposed them, we, disparaged them, we attacked them, we did all these kinds of things, which are totally legitimate tactics still. But it was always right versus left, right? What we didn't do was actually speak to the broad public in the middle. And so, over the years, I've learned a necessity of making that pivot. Always remembering, of course, that the constituency for tough on crime, for mass incarceration, for more repressive policy is almost always those in the middle who respond to political instability and danger by wanting strong man leaders and more repressive government. So that's it.
That's it. Scott, thank you. And I think you did great on time too. So kudos on that front as well. So Scott and Jose, I'm going to transition us to the final section of our panel. So thanks again. We'll see you soon. Yeah, I want to bring in Reverend Liz Theoharris and Reverend Tracy Blackman now. And I think it was actually really helpful. I mean, a lot of what Scott was framing out was really helpful. And I really actually appreciated Scott's kind of invocation of kind of spirit in some ways, and the necessity of how to actually bring people, into a movement and sustain folks, and then his, wider accounting of the last many decades, I think comes right into a conversation, of the sort of battle for the Bible, the Kairos Center often talks about, and how theology and religion is used and abused, and has been and continues to be. So I think I wanted to just bring the both of you in and actually just kind of open it up to the two of you for maybe just like a little bit of back and forth or conversation on understanding the kind of theological dynamics at play in everything that Scott and Jose and Aaron and Joaquin and Lindsay were presenting, and any words of wisdom on how we can forge a kind of theology that can build movements that we need in this moment, support and bolster. Yeah. So I don't know, Liz, do you want to start?
Sure. It's really great to be here with everybody, and thanks to everyone that's talked, and Reverend Tracy, it's awesome to get to be in conversation with you a little bit. So yeah, I think what I was thinking about a little bit while we've had these awesome presentations has been like what you said, Noam, this kind of battle for the Bible, or this fight between religious traditions and moral leaders being kind of priests of empire versus chaplains for a movement, right? And right, looking around today, we see Christian nationalism, this kind of idolatrous worldview that enables an elite strata of mostly white Christian men to rule society and amass enormous power and wealth, gaining so much traction. And like, whether it's Mike Johnson being the third most powerful person in the country who is a self-professed Christian nationalist, or whether it's how close Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and a form of religious extremism is to the White House again, or whether it's the Supreme Court, criminalizing the unhoused and overturning the right to abortion. We can go into all of the things that have been going on. We see this long-standing, but now rearing its head even more forcefully, you know, and kind of the taking up the Bible and bludgeoning poor people and people of color and indigenous people and women and LGBTQ folks and others, you know, in ways to kind of be distracting and demeaning and dividing and dispossessing people. And so I was thinking some about all of the kind of horrors of the moment, but then also some of the hope. You know, the 2,000 biblical passages throughout the Christian Bible, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian Testament that talk about justice for the poor, whether it's, you know, Mary's song where the mighty will be torn down from their thrones, and the poor will be lifted up and fed, or, you know, Jesus's inaugural sermon where he's talking about preaching good news, not the bad news of eviction, not the bad news of genocide and war, not the bad news of healthcare cuts, or, you know, not expanding and extending a child tax credit. Good news, housing, abundance for all, lifting from the bottom so everyone rises. Or I was also thinking in the conversation we're having here about some of these organizing strategies, survival strategies, that people are enacting in communities across the country. You know, I think of something like the Apostle Paul's kind of mutual solidarity for the poor, like the hope for our society doesn't come from the top. It always comes from the way that people, you know, feed and clothe and house people from below, not letting the government off from doing that, but instead showing, you know, this is the kind of beloved community. And again, that's, you know, as a Christian pastor, that's what Paul spread. That's what the early Christian communities were these places of mutual solidarity, and projects of survival, pending revolution. And so I don't know, I was thinking about that, and always love to be in conversation with you, Tracy, about how do we bring this kind of prophetic message at a time when it sounds like there's an equal sign between extremism and hate, and Christianity and religion.
Yeah, thank you for that framing, Liz, and thank you for the invitation to be here with all of you tonight. It's such an important conversation at a dire time in our society. And I want to add to what you were saying that what I'm most distressed about in terms of the consequences of what's happening is this weaponizing of the Bible in such a way that really doesn't have anything to do with the text, right? Doesn't have anything to do with what Jesus said, if you are Christian, doesn't have anything to do with being faithful to the gospel, but it is being used as a weapon to divide us. And a recent Gallup poll says that 80% of Americans now think that we are more divided than we've ever been. And a part of that division, a big part of that division, is using the Bible to suggest that othering is necessary and conquering is necessary. And this is a Christian nation, which is just simply not true, right? The freedom and the liberty and the power of Scripture is the ability to accept it for yourself, to choose it for yourself. And while I am a Christian and will always be a Christian, I have to also accept that this country is supposed to be a place of religious freedom, right? And so now in this current iteration, Christianity is the dominant faith. And though there are lots of warning signs saying that Christianity is going down, I don't fear that because the power of Christianity does not depend upon numbers, right? It just doesn't. But even if it did, the fact is that this is a country where everyone should be able to practice their faith, their religion, or their lack of faith freely. And if any of us lose that, then we've all lost it, right? If any of us cede ourselves to this grab for power under the guise of religion, we all lose it. And what is happening is that the Bible, predominantly the Bible, the Christian text, is being used to other us against one another. So, you know, I was thinking today, I was reading earlier today in preparation for something, I was thinking about when Paul describes the body of Christ as one body with all these parts. And like for all my life, I was thinking, we always talk about that as, you know, everybody's not an arm, everything's not a hand, everything. I said, but now we have transitioned from those parts being functions to those parts being factions, right? So now we are all talking about this one God. We're all talking about this one Jesus. And yet we are talking about this Jesus as though some of us have gotten him wrong, right? So you have evangelicals versus liberals. You got conservative versus progressives, right? And so what I think we have to do, one is a long-term goal. It's not going to happen before November, but we have to address biblical illiteracy in our nation, and we have to address it in pulpits all over this nation. What does it mean to actually be a follower of the way, a follower of Christ? That's a long-term thing, but in the short term, we have to find our way back to civil discourse with one another, being able to accept that we don't all see things alike, and being able to honor that that is not the role of government, that is the role of faith communities, to have this civil discourse with one another and to use that informed discourse to guide how we choose to live our lives. But faith is not to be legislated. Legislating faith is antithetical to the book that we're holding up to weaponize, right? And so I'm very concerned about the way the Bible is being used to say we need a Christian nation, or we need all people in power who think like we think, or who follow like we follow. There's no good end to that. And I'm watching the numbers increase towards fascism, because we all know that it is not, the goal is not faithfulness. The goal is dominance. The goal is restrictions for the many, because there's no way you can read the text that we're all holding up and not have compassion for the immigrants, and not have compassion for the poor, and not have compassion for the unhoused, and not see the inequity in the distribution of wealth in this country. There's no way you can do it, to look at what it means actually to be a Christian and end up in this place. So I'm concerned about that here, and I'm concerned about it globally, Liz. And perhaps in some ways, I think that as someone who is more progressive in my faith, that in an effort to be inclusive of everyone, we've been too quiet about what we know is wrong, right? And we have to figure that you've always been out there doing that. But in general, the progressive voice has been one of, oh, let's just make room for everyone at the table. And certainly we need to keep room for everyone at the table, but we have to raise our voices and speak the truth that we know about what's happening and how the Bible is being misappropriated and being misused. I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, I think that's amazing. For everyone who has ears to hear what has been said. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Well, thanks to the both of you. I guarantee you there's not another Zoom call happening in the country right now that combines economic analysis, political analysis, theological analysis, survival strategies of the poor and working class communities, you know, organizing to confront Christian nationalism and authoritarianism, and soon some song and all the rest. So it's just jam-packed and powerful and all kind of interconnected in ways that I think you all have just woven together so beautifully. So thanks to both of you. we're going to keep this train chugging along. I want to bring in Aaron Scott and Sierra Taylor and Shally Gupta Barnes. Aaron has been a friend of Kairos for a long time and is now the first gender justice officer at the Episcopal Church. And Sierra is an incredible cultural organizer, an organizer of the poor and dispossessed who leads that work at Kairos. And of course, Shally is the policy director of Kairos and the author of the forthcoming report, Survival Pending Revolution, which looks at the survival strategies that poor and dispossessed communities were deploying during the worst years of the pandemic. So Aaron, we're just going to throw it to you and then to Sierra and then to Shally. I think the three of y'all are just going to help us sort of round out this conversation with some concluding thoughts on the work that y'all are doing and how we can be mobilizing and organizing action in this moment in different ways. So Aaron, first to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me here tonight. And Noam said, I work for the presiding bishop's office of the Episcopal Church as the gender justice staff officer. And so I support all my denominations, gender justice ministries. I don't think I need to underscore too much how relevant this conversation is to that work, especially with regard to the relentless policy attacks on reproductive justice and the attacks on trans and gender nonconforming people, specifically young people. But I came to that role in the church by way of 20 years of grassroots organizing with poor, homeless, and incarcerated people across the country. And so for 8 of those years, I was doing anti-poverty work with the Episcopal Church in rural Grays Harbor County, Washington State. That's a place where we experienced a lot of vigilante violence in our work and witnessed firsthand the rapid rise of white Christian nationalist politicians at the city, county, and state levels. I think the biggest mistake we could make right now is to discount the struggles of folks at the very bottom of this society as somehow unrelated or not central to understanding this moment of political crisis. Because what's happening at the bottom right now is gonna be happening to everyone else soon enough. And I don't just mean, things getting more expensive for more and more people, although that certainly is the foundation of a lot of things. I mean also the stuff we're seeing in terms of political repression. So one example, really short from our work, is that in June of 2020, I was supporting local poor and homeless leaders in Aberdeen, Washington, to host a prayer vigil, a public outdoor prayer vigil in solidarity both with the George Floyd uprisings nationwide and also to highlight what had been happening locally with deaths of local people killed by law enforcement. And for doing that work, we were held up at gunpoint in broad daylight by an armed mob of counter-protesters who had been turned out through rampant misinformation and disinformation online, and also coordinated in part by elected officials. Local law enforcement responding to it stood around shaking hands and taking photos with those people. So this was 7 months before January 6th. And on January 6th, we were back at the office having our morning meeting. Somebody turned the TV on. We saw what was happening in DC, and our leaders, who were all poor people, formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless people, said, "Oh, they practiced on us first before they took that show to DC." There was just a clear sense that strategy and many other strategies had already been experimented on poor communities. I think maybe the most important lesson we learned from that specific experience is that you don't stop organizing when things like that happen. So we had gone that day directly from being chased around town by a militia, to walking back over to the church where we ran our free community dinners, and everybody just gloved up and fed about 100 people as usual. We kept showing up for people's jail visits. We kept running political education. We kept counter recruiting from white supremacist gangs. Because we cannot quit. We can do stuff, we can take breaks, we can take turns, we can take care of ourselves. We have to do that. We can move around to different fronts of work as necessary, but collectively together, we have to keep pushing forward. We got to refuse to cede any terrain, any community, because nobody is going to come to save our communities except us, right? No party is going to fix this for us. And there's not like a pure political vibe, left, right, or center, I think, that is going to save us. I think the bottom is going to save us. Is people, the leadership of people at the bottom of this society is where we need to be throwing in all of our support and our attention and our investment in finding and lifting up the leaders that we need for this particular moment. I think that's where we're going to find the people who are going to get us out of this mess. Thank you so much. I love being here with you all.
Thank you, Erin. I like to talk as little as possible between Erin and Sierra because I just want them to get as much time as possible. So Sierra, I'm just going to throw it straight to you.
Okay, thank you, Noam. Wow, thank you so much, Jarvis and Shally, for this incredible work that you did and pulling together these communities, some of which, I've been fortunate enough to organize alongside, and many of which I'm learning about from this report. And I think it's just been heartening to hear as a cultural organizer, who always just kind of feels like, what about us? It's been really wonderful to hear how you all have employed arts and culture into your organizing work. And, in our network of the Kairos Center, we say that movements begin with the telling of untold stories. And these stories, I feel like, are being highlighted in this report and in our coming together, tonight and other ways. And I believe that that's like the power of art and culture, to be able to tell our stories, to be able to build a movement that is in our image, with our morality, with our clarity, with our needs at the basis of that. Art and culture is able to transcend beyond space, beyond time, beyond ability, and even language. It's just this very beautiful tool that I believe, alongside with my colleagues at the Kairos Center. Shout out to Pauline and Sharon. I said Pauline. Pauline and Sharon, because I feel like we've learned so much together. I know I've just basically run out of time, but just really feeling that every movement really has to take art and culture seriously, because our enemy does, because the ruling class does, because the state does, because right now they set the narrative. They find ways to divide us, to manipulate us against one another. And all of the stories that people have shared, we've pointed that out. And also in all of the stories that folks have shared, I'm hearing ways in which people are counteracting those narratives by coming together, having these courageous conversations and engaging in action and work together. And like Erin was saying, I just believe that if we come together, if we lift from the bottom, everyone rises. Art and culture. Thank you, Jarvis and Shally.
So I just, just have been really enjoying this conversation and all of the insights that have been shared so far. And just wanted to share a little bit about this report that has been mentioned a couple of times on the survival strategies that that were used during the pandemic to meet just a whole bunch of needs. Over the past year or so, the Kairos Center talked with communities across the country organizers, faith leaders, cultural organizers, community-based organizations about what they did to make sure that their people were okay. And as we all know, there was just this alarming range of needs that was going unmet, reflecting these deep gaps in our system and institutions, gaps that were created by the tax cuts and privatization, and by misplaced national priorities that fund war, but not everything we need. And all those gaps still remain, as we know. And who stepped into those gaps, as always, are our communities themselves, figuring out how to get sanitizer and showers and beds and clean air and Wi-Fi, just all these things that we need to live, to the people who needed them. And this isn't new. It's what people have always done, alongside sharing meals and playing together and praying together and mourning together. But the pandemic just kind of blew the lid off of this, just the extent of this activity, and as well as the compassion and creativity and courage with which it was carried out. And some groups that had never done this before were thrown into it because their communities need it. And as we've heard over and over again, no one else was coming in to save them. And so despite the challenges that were faced across the board, across all of these strategies, there was also consensus, at least among the people we talked to, that meeting these concrete material needs has to play a more significant role in our organizing and our movements and in our response to these anti-democratic authoritarian threats. And the threat of white Christian nationalism, it has to be more of a role than it currently does. And we also know that we're not quite equipped to do that at scale, right? Despite the best that our churches and organizations and all the community associations were part of, the best we can do, there's no way we can really respond to the extent of the need at hand, or even some of these threats that are building on the horizon as we're currently organized and resourced to do, right? But if and when, as we start to bring these efforts together, the fact is that millions and millions and millions of people are already doing this every day, right? And it's going on, but it's not kind of connected or even consciously politicized as a critique of the status quo and the vision of the society that we deserve, because this work is inherently political. These are all forms of protest. Every project of survival, every survival strategy is a form of protest against government neglect. And as we seek to stand in that gap, we have to highlight the hypocrisy that it's as if regular people have the power to meet these needs, why isn't it happening? And one of the historical examples I'll wrap up with, because I'm just looking at our time, that I think is important to hold on to as we face these threats, as we figure out, as we try to make our way through and assess what can we really do, is the Underground Railroad, right? Formerly enslaved people, or currently enslaved people, were running from slavery, seeking their freedom. That was their first act, the first act that was necessary to create then a vast network of individuals, of households, communities, churches, schools, every kind of community-based institution that was actually meeting very concrete material needs. And eventually, maybe not right away, but eventually came together around the common political goal of ending slavery. The network was diffuse, it was dispersed, it didn't quite know what all the other pieces of it were doing, but it was taking action together, and it was led by those who were most impacted by the injustices of that time, by slavery itself. And as a whole, the whole that was created was greater than the sum of its parts. And that's, what in our assessments, also what we need to do today, right? A movement anchored in this work that is going on out of necessity because our systems are failing us, and these threats are killing us and threatening, and making our lives less secure and more dangerous. Can we pull all that together and politicize it to take action together? And if and when we do, this network, I think we believe that this network, a project of survival in these poor, frontline, dispossessed communities, can also be a buttress against extremism and build up the substantive movement for democracy, by turning the needs that people are organizing around into demands of a government of, by, and for the people. So that's the responsibility and our task in this moment. And we just invite everybody in to build this with us.
Well, thank you, Shally and Sierra and Aaron. Thank you as well, and to all of our panelists, and to all of you for sticking with us here to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on a Thursday night. Kids at home and things to do, but this is just an vitally important conversation, and that we'll continue to have this conversation. Keep an eye out for the report that Shally and our colleague Jarvis authored. It will be coming out in the coming months, and we'll have more conversations like this around that report and other work. So yeah, I hope tonight was thought provoking and soul stirring. I'm going to stop talking because I don't have more to say, but I'm going to bring my colleague Sharon on to close us out in song. Because as Sierra said, cultural organizing, it's not window dressing, it's the center of our work. And at the Kairos Center, we never do a call without song at the center of it. So we started with song, we'll end with song. And thanks again, and have a great night, folks.
Thanks, Noam, and thanks everybody for joining this evening and for all the powerful panelists and discussion that's being had. We know it's so important in this moment that people are hurting and that, people are looking for something at the same time, and that there's a need for deep organizing, especially in unorganized communities. And there's a need to recognize, I'll lift up what Aaron Scott was sharing at the end, that the leadership and organization of those at the bottom, that is really what will drive us forward, and to really be a united front across this country. And I think Scott, who just was with us as well, lifting up that, there are things that we are connected around and need to lift those up. And so we want to close this evening out with a song that was shared with us by a leader, by a Rose to Ray, that says, "I'm going to lift my sister up. She's not heavy. If I don't lift her up, we will all fall down." And we know that that's the stakes that we're playing with right now, that if we don't lift each other up, that we will all fall down. And we are called in this moment to lift each other up. And I'll ask you can please join in wherever you are. I'm gonna lift my sister up. She is not heavy. I'm gonna lift my sister up. She's not heavy. I'm gonna lift my sister up. She is not heavy. If I don't lift her up, if I don't lift her up, if I don't lift her up, we will fall down. And I'm gonna lift my brother up. He is not heavy. I'm gonna lift my brother up. He's not heavy. I'm gonna lift my brother up. He is not heavy. If I don't lift him up, if I don't lift him up, if I don't lift him up, we will fall down. We're gonna lift our siblings up. They are not heavy. We're gonna lift our siblings up. They're not heavy. We're gonna lift our siblings up. They are not heavy. If we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, we will fall down. We're gonna lift our children up. Our children up, they are not heavy. We're gonna lift our children up, they're not heavy. We're gonna lift our children up, they are not heavy. If we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, we will fall down. We're gonna lift our people, we're gonna lift our people up. They are not heavy. Y'all join me now. We're gonna lift our people up, they're not heavy. We're gonna lift our people up, they are not heavy. If we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, if we don't lift them up, we will fall down. Thank you all for joining us.